On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers struck a tiny American outpost, so small it barely qualified as an island at all. A coral atoll called Wake, defended by a garrison of a few hundred Marines, a handful of aging fighter aircraft, and roughly 1,200 civilian construction workers, who had never expected to find themselves in the middle of a war. 3 days later, when a Japanese invasion force arrived to finish the job, the defenders of Wake Island did something almost nobody in the opening catastrophic days of the Pacific War had managed. They fought back and won, sinking Japanese warships and driving off an invasion fleet in one of the only unambiguous American victories anywhere in the Pacific during those first dark weeks. The island would not hold forever. But what happened to the men who defended it, and what happened to the prisoners left behind after it finally fell, is a story of both extraordinary courage and one of the most brutal and least remembered atrocities of the entire Pacific War. This is the story of what happened to the Marines and civilians who refused to surrender Wake Island, and the fate that awaited many of them long after the fighting there had ended. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a garrison of a few hundred men, armed with equipment already considered obsolete, actually manage to defeat a Japanese invasion fleet in the same week that Japan was winning nearly everywhere else in the Pacific? Wake Island's strategic value, modest as its physical size and pre-war garrison might suggest, lay in its position as a critical link in the chain of island bases connecting Hawaii to the American-held Philippines and Guam, a stopover point for both military reinforcement flights and, before the war, trans-Pacific commercial aviation, making its defense a genuine strategic priority for American planners, even though the resources actually committed to that defense by December of 1941 remained, by any measure, seriously inadequate to the threat the island would soon face. The garrison's commanding officers, Devereaux overseeing ground defense, and Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham holding overall island command, arrived at their positions only shortly before the war began, inheriting a defensive plan and fortification effort that remained genuinely incomplete. With construction of permanent gun emplacements and other defensive infrastructure still actively underway when the first Japanese bombs fell, a circumstance that meant much of the defense the garrison ultimately mounted depended on improvisation and adaptation of whatever partially completed positions and equipment happened to be available rather than a fully realized, pre-war defensive plan executed as originally designed. Wake Island in December of 1941 was, by any conventional military standard, barely defended at all. A small coral atoll garrisoned by roughly 450 Marines of the 1st Defense Battalion, under Major James Devereaux, supported by 12 Grumman Wildcat fighters of Marine Fighter Squadron 211, aircraft that had arrived on the island only days before the war began, and that represented, even by the standards of American fighters in December of 1941, an aging and outmatched design compared to the Japanese Zero fighters they would soon face. Alongside the military garrison, roughly 1,200 civilian contractors remained on the island, workers employed to complete the base's still unfinished defensive and logistical infrastructure, men who suddenly found themselves trapped in a combat zone, with no military training, and no real choice but to assist however they could once the fighting began. The first Japanese attack on December 8th, launched almost simultaneously with the Pearl Harbor strike, given Wake's position on the opposite side of the international dateline, destroyed a significant portion of the island's already limited aircraft on the ground and inflicted serious casualties, a devastating opening blow that left the garrison with only a handful of operational fighters and a defensive position that most outside observers would have assumed could not hold against any serious follow-up invasion attempt. The civilian contractors present on the island employed by a private construction company completing the base's infrastructure under a pre-war contract, found themselves in a genuinely unusual and dangerous position once the fighting began. Men with no military training or combat obligation who nonetheless faced the same bombing raids and, eventually, the same invasion the military garrison confronted, a circumstance that led a substantial number of these civilian workers to volunteer for combat roles alongside the Marines, despite having no formal duty to do so, manning weapons, and assisting in the defense, in ways that blurred the conventional distinction between military and civilian personnel throughout the siege. That follow-up invasion attempt arrived on December 11th, when a Japanese naval force approached the island intending a straightforward amphibious landing, supported by naval gunfire, an operation Japanese commanders expected to succeed quickly, given the garrison's limited numbers and equipment. What happened instead became one of the most celebrated defensive actions of the war's opening weeks. Marine coastal artillery batteries, holding fire until the approaching Japanese ships had closed to effective range, opened up with a devastating and precisely timed barrage that struck and damaged several Japanese vessels, while the handful of remaining Wildcat fighters, flying repeated sorties against the invasion force, contributed further damage from the air. The Japanese destroyer Hayate was sunk outright, the first Japanese warship lost to American forces in the entire war, and the invasion force, having sustained losses it had not anticipated against what should have been a lightly defended target, withdrew rather than press the landing. The specific tactical discipline the Marine gunners showed on December 11th, holding fire until the approaching Japanese ships had closed well within effective range rather than opening up prematurely at longer distance, reflected sound artillery doctrine but also required genuine nerve under the pressure of watching an enemy invasion fleet steadily approach, a restraint that several accounts from Marines present that day describe as one of the more psychologically demanding aspects of the entire engagement, waiting in prepared positions while Japanese ships drew closer and closer before finally receiving the order to fire. This victory, arriving amid a string of otherwise uniformly catastrophic news from across the Pacific in the war's opening days, received enormous and immediate attention in the American press, a rare moment of genuine tactical success that provided a significant, if ultimately temporary, boost to American public morale during one of the darkest stretches of the entire war. The American press coverage of the December 11th victory, arriving as it did during a period when nearly every other piece of Pacific War news reaching the home front described catastrophe and defeat, produced a level of public attention and celebration that somewhat outpaced the tactical significance of the engagement itself. A single, genuinely impressive but strategically limited success, elevated in public perception to something closer to a major turning point, a gap between battlefield reality and public narrative that several historians studying wartime American media coverage have identified as characteristic of how desperately the home front needed positive news during those specific opening weeks of the war. Stop and consider what the defenders actually knew, in the days following that first victory, about what was likely still coming, because the garrison's success on December 11th, however genuinely impressive, had not changed the fundamental strategic reality facing the island. Wake remained isolated. Resupply and reinforcement from Pearl Harbor remained uncertain and, as it would turn out, ultimately would not arrive in time, and Japanese commanders, having suffered an embarrassing setback, were already assembling a considerably larger second invasion force, this time with direct carrier air support, to ensure the island's capture regardless of whatever additional resistance the garrison might offer. American naval leadership at Pearl Harbor did, in fact, assemble a relief expedition intended to reinforce Wake Island in the days following the first successful defense. A task force built around the carrier Saratoga carrying additional Marine aircraft and reinforcements toward the besieged garrison. This relief force, however, was recalled before reaching the island, a decision driven by a combination of factors, including uncertainty about the location and strength of Japanese naval forces in the area, and broader caution about risking scarce American carrier assets so soon after the Pearl Harbor disaster. A decision that has remained a subject of historical debate ever since, with some historians arguing a more aggressive relief effort might have allowed the garrison to hold out considerably longer, if not indefinitely, against the second Japanese invasion attempt. When this larger Japanese force returned on December 23rd, it landed with overwhelming numerical superiority against a garrison that had already been fighting continuously for more than 2 weeks, running low on ammunition, food, and, critically, aircraft, with the last operational Wildcats destroyed or rendered inoperable during the fighting's final days. Devereaux himself, coordinating the ground defense during these final desperate hours, faced the same impossible calculation that so many commanders across the Pacific War would confront in similarly hopeless tactical situations, weighing the value of continued resistance against the mounting cost in lives, both military and civilian, that prolonging a defense with no realistic prospect of ultimate success would exact. His own account of these final hours, given in post-war interviews and writings, described a defense conducted with a specific and painful awareness that every additional hour of resistance came at a direct and escalating human cost to men who had already fought far longer and harder than anyone had reasonably expected the small garrison to manage. Marines and the civilian volunteers who had taken up arms alongside them fought a desperate, close-quarters defense through the island's final hours, inflicting casualties on the landing force, even as the tactical situation became increasingly hopeless, until Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham, the island's overall commander, made the decision to surrender rather than continue a resistance that could no longer meaningfully delay the inevitable outcome, and that risked the total destruction of the remaining garrison and civilian population for no achievable strategic purpose. The surrender itself, when it finally came, was conducted amid ongoing confusion and, according to several survivor accounts, genuine danger, even in its final administrative moments, since not every isolated pocket of Marine and civilian resistance received word of the surrender order simultaneously, meaning some small groups continued fighting for a period after the formal capitulation had already been arranged elsewhere on the island. A common and dangerous feature of surrenders conducted under the chaotic conditions of an active, multi-front battle rather than a more orderly, centrally coordinated capitulation. The roughly 1,500 American military personnel and civilian contractors captured when Wake Island finally fell faced years of difficult captivity that followed patterns familiar from other Pacific POW experiences, most eventually transported to prison camps in Japan and Japanese-occupied China, enduring the same combination of malnutrition, forced labor, and harsh treatment that characterized Japanese POW camps broadly throughout the war. But a specific subset of the captured civilian contractors, roughly 98 men, were retained on Wake Island itself rather than transported elsewhere, kept as forced laborers to continue construction and maintenance work on the island's fortifications under the Japanese garrison that remained stationed there for the remainder of the war. Conditions for these retained civilian workers grew progressively harsher as the war continued, and Wake Island became increasingly isolated from any reliable Japanese resupply, since American submarine and, eventually, air interdiction of Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific made maintaining even minimal supply levels to an isolated garrison holding an island of limited strategic value. By this stage of the war, an increasingly difficult and low-priority undertaking, a logistics squeeze that affected the treatment and provisioning of the Japanese garrison itself, and, by direct extension, the civilian prisoners being forced to labor under that garrison's control. These 98 civilian prisoners endured harsh conditions and forced labor on the isolated island for nearly 2 years, a captivity that took a particularly dark and tragic turn in October of 1943, when American carrier aircraft conducted a raid against Wake Island as part of the broader Central Pacific campaign then getting underway. Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara, commanding the Japanese garrison on Wake and apparently fearing that the raid signaled an imminent American invasion attempt, made the decision to execute the entire group of remaining civilian prisoners. A mass killing carried out specifically to eliminate the security risk these prisoners were perceived to represent in the event American forces actually landed on the island. The October 1943 carrier raid that triggered Sakaibara's decision was, in strategic terms, a comparatively routine operation within the broader American Central Pacific campaign, then developing, part of a pattern of raids against various Japanese-held islands, intended to degrade Japanese defensive capability and gather intelligence ahead of the major island-hopping offensives still to come. Rather than any specific, imminent invasion of Wake Island itself, a strategic reality entirely unknown to Sakaibara at the time, who had no way of confirming whether the raid represented a prelude to invasion or simply another in a series of hit-and-run strikes against isolated Japanese garrisons. The specific method and circumstances of the executions, reconstructed by American investigators after the war, through Japanese military records, and testimony from surviving Japanese personnel who had been stationed on the island, described a coordinated, systematic operation carried out over the course of a single day, the prisoners taken from their forced labor duties, blindfolded, and killed in a location on the island specifically chosen for the purpose, a level of premeditated organization that post-war prosecutors would later cite specifically as evidence undermining any claim the killings represented a spontaneous or panicked reaction to the earlier carrier raid, rather than a calculated decision carried out with deliberate planning. The execution of the 98 civilian prisoners represents one of the more brutal and, outside of specialist historical circles, less widely known atrocities of the entire Pacific War. A mass killing of unarmed civilian contractors carried out not in the heat of combat, but as a calculated, premeditated security measure taken by a garrison commander anticipating an invasion that, as it turned out, did not actually materialize at that specific time. One of the 98 prisoners managed to briefly escape the execution, and before being recaptured, carved a simple, haunting inscription into a large coral rock on the island, recording the date and the number of men killed. A message discovered after the war that became one of the primary pieces of physical evidence documenting exactly when and how the massacre had occurred. The carved rock inscription itself, discovered by American forces only after Japan's surrender, when Wake Island was finally reoccupied, became a specific and powerful piece of physical evidence in the subsequent war crimes investigation, a simple, direct record left by a man who understood, in his final hours of freedom before recapture, that he might be the only remaining witness capable of documenting what had actually happened to the 97 other men killed alongside him, a final act of testimony carved into stone, specifically because he had no other means of ensuring the truth would eventually be known. The escaped prisoner was recaptured and personally killed by Sakaibara himself, according to post-war testimony and investigation, closing out the massacre with no surviving witnesses among the civilian prisoners themselves. The Japanese garrison remaining on Wake Island, isolated and increasingly cut off from any meaningful resupply or reinforcement for the remainder of the war, was never actually subjected to the full-scale American invasion Sakaibara had feared when he ordered the executions. American strategic planners, having concluded that the island, whatever its earlier significance, no longer justified the cost of a direct assault once the broader Central Pacific campaign had bypassed it in favor of other objectives, meaning the Japanese garrison simply remained in place, increasingly starved and isolated, until Japan's eventual surrender in August of 1945 finally brought the war on Wake Island to its actual conclusion. More than 3 years after the massacre, the garrison commander had ordered out of fear of an invasion that, in the end, never actually came. After Japan's surrender, American investigators, piecing together the full scope of what had happened on Wake Island during the war's final 2 years, uncovered the story of the massacre through surviving Japanese military records, testimony from Japanese personnel who had served on the island, and the physical evidence of the carved rock inscription itself, evidence that formed the basis for a post-war war crimes prosecution against Sakaibara and several other Japanese officers, directly implicated in ordering and carrying out the executions. The War Crimes Tribunal that tried Sakaibara heard extensive testimony reconstructing the massacre in careful detail, and the resulting conviction and sentence represented one of the more clear-cut and thoroughly documented war crimes prosecutions to emerge from the entire Pacific Theater. A case in which the physical evidence of the carved rock inscription, combined with surviving Japanese military records and personnel testimony, left comparatively little of the ambiguity that complicated some other post-war war crimes prosecutions where documentary evidence had been destroyed or witnesses had not survived to testify. Sakaibara was tried, convicted, and executed for the massacre in 1947, a legal accountability that arrived for the families of the 98 murdered civilian contractors years after their loved ones had already been killed on an isolated Pacific island most Americans had only briefly heard of during the initial, celebrated defense back in December of 1941. Families of the 98 murdered civilian contractors, many of whom had spent years after the war's end, simply hoping their loved ones might eventually be located among the general population of returning POWs, faced their own particular and delayed grief once the full circumstances of the massacre finally became known through the post-war investigation and trial. A specific and painful form of loss, compounded by having initially held on to hope for a survival that, for these 98 men specifically, had actually ended years earlier, on the same isolated island, where their loved ones had once helped win one of the only clear-cut American victories of the Pacific War's darkest opening weeks. The surviving military and civilian prisoners who had been transported off Wake Island to camps in Japan and China endured the remainder of the war under the same difficult conditions faced by Pacific POWs broadly, and those who survived to see Japan's surrender in 1945 returned home carrying both the specific memory of the island's celebrated initial defense and, for those who learned of it, the devastating knowledge of what had happened to the civilian colleagues left behind on the island itself. The broader story of Wake Island, taken as a complete arc from the celebrated December 11th victory through the eventual surrender and the massacre that followed nearly 2 years later, resists the simple, uncomplicated heroic narrative that the island's early defense alone might suggest. A reminder that even the Pacific War's genuine and celebrated moments of triumph frequently carried forward into far darker and less publicly remembered chapters for the men who lived, and in the case of the 98 civilian prisoners, did not live, to see how their own individual stories actually ended. Remember the question this story opened with: how does a garrison of a few hundred men, armed with equipment already considered obsolete, actually defeat a Japanese invasion fleet in the same week Japan was winning nearly everywhere else in the Pacific? The honest answer, drawn from the specific documented sequence of that December, is that it came down to disciplined artillery gunners, willing to hold fire under enormous pressure, a handful of outmatched aircraft, flown with genuine skill and aggression, and an invasion force that, encountering resistance it had not expected against a target it had badly underestimated, chose to withdraw rather than press forward at a cost it had not planned to pay. That the same island's story would end, less than 2 years later, in the calculated murder of 98 unarmed civilian prisoners, is the part of Wake Island's history that the earlier celebrated victory has, for most of the 8 decades since, largely overshadowed. If you want to understand not just the celebrated early defense of Wake Island, but the full and often much darker story of what happened to the men who defended it, and the civilians left behind after it finally fell, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.